In January 1824, Greece was the location for the end of an era in English literature. The death of Lord Byron, as he fought for the cause of Greek independence, marks the conclusion of English poetry's Romantic Age. Keats and Shelley were already dead. The finest poems of Wordsworth and Coleridge had already been written. With the death of Byron, the greatest ever period of English verse drew to its close. Inevitably, the achievements of the Romantics overshadowed the work of those that came after them. Yet the English poets of the later 19th century created some of the finest verse in the whole of the English language, at a time when Britain was more powerful than ever before. They are the poets of the Victorian Age. The 63-year reign of Queen Victoria saw Great Britain at the peak of her power as a nation. Industry and commerce made Britain wealthy, and the strength of the Royal Navy made her secure. It was a time of invention and achievement in all areas of life. In literature, the Victorian Age saw the increasing popularity of the novel, with the works of Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, and many others. In poetry, too, it was a productive age. The Victorian nonsense verses of Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll remain popular today, while more traditional poetic forms also flourished. With hindsight, 5 poets can be seen as the key figures of Victorian verse: Gerard Manley Hopkins, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, and the greatest of them all, Alfred Tennyson. The poetic talent of Alfred Tennyson revealed itself early on in life. Born in 1809 in the Lincolnshire village of Somersby, the son of a clergyman, the boy Tennyson began to compose verse at the age of just 8. In his youth, he explored the wide variety of poetic forms and showed a keen enthusiasm for Byron. In 1827, he went up to Cambridge University, where he soon won a prize for Timbuktu, a blank verse composition. In 1830, while still a student, he published his first solo volume of work and formed an intense friendship with Arthur Hallam, a fellow poet. Although Tennyson left university without a degree, he was, by then, convinced of his destiny as a man of verse. In 1832, he published his second anthology, simply entitled Poems. These early volumes attracted the attention of Leigh Hunt, the poet and critic, who had earlier recognized the genius of John Keats. The second volume also included The Lady of Shalott, an early indication of Tennyson's fascination with the legends of King Arthur. It would be an interest that would last his entire life.
Tennyson had been interested in the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table from a small boy. He'd read Malory, he'd read other historical sources, he'd begun to write prose accounts of the story, and it stayed with him really almost till the end of his poetic career. When, in that very fertile period of writing after Arthur Hallam's death and before, he wrote The Lady of Shalott, which is a version of the story of Lancelot and Elaine. In the period immediately after Arthur Hallam's death, he wrote Morte d'Arthur, which he then rewrote as the passing of Arthur in the Idylls of the King.
The Arthurian legends offered Tennyson a kind of escape from the modern world. Tennyson, like many Victorian poets, felt that the modern world was an unpoetic world. Arthurian legend gave him an idealised set of characters, an idealised landscape. This was a world of love and chivalry and beauty.
The medieval knights in armour, the legends of the Middle Ages too, like King Arthur, provide the obvious point of contrast. So if you wanted to say, what is the condition of modern life, one way of answering that question is to say, what was the other condition of life? And one very vivid way of dramatising it was to choose Arthurian subject matter, because the other way of life was not just sort of socially and economically different, it also involved different religious assumptions, for example. And the Arthurian legend, as it had been developed in the Middle Ages, had very strong Christian connotations.
The notion of playing with Arthurian myth was very much a notion of challenging a modernising society at the very basis of its ideals. Ideals is the word we want here. This is idealistic poetry. We must add the rider to that the ideals for Tennyson the young Alfred Tennyson as well as the later Alfred Lord Tennyson, these ideals are always doomed at profound levels. It makes for a melancholy poetry, and one in which a youthful, oppositional stance can easily harden over time into a melancholic conservatism.
Tennyson's earliest works were often harshly criticised, and this proved depressing for a man who was naturally gloomy. In 1833, an event occurred which made him even more distressed: the death of his dear college friend Arthur Hallam. Tennyson was devastated. He turned away from poetry in favour of reading and reflective contemplation. For almost 10 years, he published virtually nothing.
The friendship between Arthur Hallam and Tennyson has been constantly mulled over by biographers and by critics. It was a very intense emotional friendship of the kind that many Victorian young men had. It was a kind of meeting of minds, and also they found one another extremely congenial. Tennyson had a very lively family with sisters and a mother at home in Somersby. Arthur Hallam's father, Henry, was a distinguished historian, a very loving father, but a very cold man. So Hallam, if you like, was in love with the whole Tennyson family, and more specifically, he was in love, or became in love, fell in love with Tennyson's sister, Emily, whom he was to marry.
This deliberate silence had consequences for his personal life. It prevented him marrying his fiancée, Emily Selwood. But Emily was prepared to wait for Alfred, and eventually his muse returned. In 1842, he published a further 2-volume compilation of work, again simply entitled Poems. In it, he tackled a variety of poetic forms. In Morte d'Arthur, he demonstrated his mastery of the idyll as he returned once again to the Arthurian theme. The Poems compilation also demonstrated Tennyson's abilities in lyric verse.
Break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea. But the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me.
It's not insignificant that the poem uses the image of the sea and the waves. Tennyson linked the sea with the death of Hallam. Hallam had died in Vienna very suddenly of apoplexy, but he was brought home by his father to be buried in England. The journey was by sea. It crops up in Memoriam, and it began here with this very poignant poem in which the breaking of the waves recall to Tennyson his grief over his friend.
Tennyson, like his great contemporary, the novelist Dickens, had an astonishing capacity, a very rare capacity, to be simple and complicated at the same time. He was genuinely popular, and the poem has that kind of insistent rhythm, simple rhythm. It has emotional openness and directness. The diction is simple, it doesn't use complicated words, the imagery is simple and familiar. So it speaks very immediately, and yet it's actually a rather tricky, complicated, ingenious poem. It begins by making you think it's going to be a romantic nature poem. It's all going to be about the sea. And it isn't at all. It's all about social and human things. And at the end of the poem, it suddenly emerges that the point about the sea is not, as it would be for Wordsworth or a romantic poet, that the sea, wild nature, is like us. On the contrary, the point is that it's very alien from us. The sea goes on endlessly, breaking on the beach, but human beings die and disappear and are lost.
Throughout his long working life, Tennyson continued to use a variety of poetic forms, including the elegy, the poem in praise of the departed dead. Throughout his years of silence and in the years that followed, he worked on the elegy that would make him a famous man.
But thou and I are one in kind, as moulded like in nature's mint, and hill and wood and field did print the same sweet forms in either mind.
In Memoriam is one of the greatest poems of the Victorian age. It's great, I think, because it registers universal human emotions of love and loss, grief for the lost love. But it does so in a way that is quite modern, in the sense that it shows us the fluctuations of grief and of love, the fact that human feeling doesn't run a smooth course.
In Memoriam was and is still far more than just a tribute to a lost acquaintance. It's also a study in spiritual meaning. Profound questions concerning the purpose of life on earth are addressed. Technically, it was also significant. Tennyson was amongst the first English poets to adopt the A-B-B-A rhyme structure, which contributes so much to the recurring sadness of the verse.
The final line, although it rhymes with the first line, nonetheless isn't part of a couplet, and therefore sounds somehow less conclusive than the two middle lines. It hints at the doubt, the uncertainty that Tennyson's talking about in intellectual terms in the poem as a whole.
Far off thou art, but ever nigh. I have thee still, and I rejoice. I prosper, circled with thy voice. I shall not lose thee, though I die.
In Memoriam, which was published in 1850, is a work that Tennyson was hoarding up in small pieces for many years before. In fact, it's only quite late in the work's composition that Tennyson begins to realise he's dealing not with a series of short interrelated lyrics, but with one large poem. It is, for me, the greatest long poem of the 19th century. But we must remember that this long poem is made up of separate and often really rather short lyric moments.
In Memoriam was the poem that made Alfred Tennyson famous. Published in 1850, its success meant he was now able to marry his longtime fiancée, and the same year he was appointed State Poet of Great Britain, the Poet Laureate. Unlike some others who have held the post, Tennyson took his duties as national poet seriously. He composed a memorable tribute to the British general and statesman, the Duke of Wellington, and in 1854 he published possibly his best-known poem, an account of a disastrous engagement of the Crimean War, The Charge of the Light Brigade. The whole conflict was noteworthy for the incompetence of the British commanders, but the charge of the Light Brigade proved especially disastrous for their unfortunate troops. Tennyson's words to describe it have never been surpassed.
Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the Light Brigade! Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
The Charge of the Light Brigade may not have been Tennyson's greatest technical achievement, but its publication only served to increase his status. He was now a major public figure. But, as is often the case, we can now see that Tennyson's greatest work was written before he became famous. Not that he was idle in his later decades. He continued to work on a prodigious scale, writing dramas and further compilations of poetry. He also returned to the Arthurian legends, which he loved so much. In 1885, at the age of 76, he finally published Idylls of the King, a definitive interpretation of the Arthurian legend where the nature of human relationship is once again addressed.
In love, if love be love, if love be ours, faith and unfaith can ne'er be equal powers. Unfaith in aught is want of faith in all. It is the little rift within the lute that by and by will make the music mute, and ever widening slowly silence all. The little rift within the lover's lute, or little pitted speck in garnered fruit, that rotting innard slowly moulders all. It is not worth the keeping, let it go. But shall it? Answer, darling, answer no. And trust me not at all, or all in all.
He felt that the epic was the ultimate challenge for a poet, a long poem in 12 books modelled on the Odyssey or the Iliad, and so it took him time to work himself up to it. Critics comment on how pallid a character King Arthur is, and it was almost as though Tennyson felt that he was closely associated with Arthur and couldn't somehow dramatise this character. And the more interesting characters in the Idylls of the King are Lancelot and Guinevere. Tennyson was deeply upset by that element of the story, the fact that a great king could be brought low by the infidelity of his wife and his best friend. And so the whole story, the Idylls of the King, rather than being this great triumphant epic, becomes a series of poems which convey disillusionment, bitterness, and they're very much poems written at the end of his life.
By the time The Idylls of the King was published, Alfred Tennyson had become Alfred Lord Tennyson in recognition of his achievements, and he continued to work until his death in 1892. If, as many believe, Tennyson was the greatest English poet of his age, then it is likely the second greatest died 3 years before him. This was a poet whose work took a long time to be recognised, but whose innovative and expressive compositions are now accepted as amongst the finest of the Victorian age. Robert Browning. Born in 1812, Robert Browning's upbringing was different from that of most of the major figures of Victorian verse. He did not attend university, and his formal schooling came to an end at the age of just 14. But he was always determined to become a famous poet. He first attracted attention in 1835 with Paracelsus, a dramatic composition whose major influences were to stay with him throughout his career. The year before, he had visited Italy for the first time, and he grew fascinated with the Italian Renaissance. Paracelsus, like most of Browning's later work, was set in that great period of artistic achievement.
Browning's reputation has had a checkered history. His early poetry, for instance, Pauline and Sordello, met with very little favour. Indeed, Pauline didn't sell a single copy, and Sordello was universally criticised for being obscure. Indeed, one reader said that having read the whole poem, and it's a long one, she still didn't know if Sordello was a person, a city or a book.
He turned his hand to drama with a conspicuous lack of success. Virtually none of his plays are in the repertoire today. Fortunately, he continued with his poetic development, and in 1845 he published one of his best-known short poems, one directly inspired by his periods away from his homeland.
Oh, to be in England, now that April's there, and whoever wakes in England sees some morning unaware that the lowest boughs and the brushwood sheaf round the elm tree bole are in tiny leaf, while the chaffinch sings on the orchard bough in England now.
The year 1845 was one of the most significant of Browning's life. That year he made the acquaintance of Elizabeth Barrett, an established poet whose work was greatly influenced by the literature of ancient Greece. Soon, a romantic relationship began between the two poets, and in 1846 they were married. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's father disapproved of the match. In addition, Elizabeth was afflicted with a serious lung complaint. They decided to leave London and head for Italy, where they settled in the city that had been at the centre of the Italian Renaissance, Florence.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a more famous poet than her husband. Throughout her lifetime, it was actually only after her death, really, that Browning emerged to real prominence. He did achieve sort of fame and indeed a degree of popularity in the later part of his career, at which point his reputation was as an intensely difficult, obscure poet. I mean, people liked him and admired him, but thought he was sort of fiendishly difficult and hard to understand in ways which actually we now find rather baffling. I mean, he doesn't seem that difficult to modern readers, and I guess it was more to do with the originality of his form, I mean, what he was doing with the dramatic monologue.
In poems such as the blank verse Andrea del Sarto, inspired by the Italian Renaissance artist, and in the remarkable Two in the Campagna, he developed the poem in which an individual character talks directly to the reader, the dramatic monologue.
I wonder, do you feel today, as I have felt since, hand in hand, we sat down on the grass to stray in spirit better through the land, this morn of Rome and May? For me, I touched a thought I know has tantalized me many times, like turns of thread the spiders throw mocking across our path for rhymes to catch at and let go.
The dramatic monologue is the poetic form most closely associated with Browning. In fact, he neither invented it nor did it end with his writing. The important thing about the dramatic monologue, as the Victorian poets used it, Browning most of all, but certainly Tennyson and indeed Christina Rossetti, is that it provides us with the link between Romantic poetry and the modernists. Victorian poetry is so often overlooked. Here was a key poetic form which drew on the Romantic poetry which had preceded it and developed out of that poetry and gave something very significant to 20th century poetry.
In putting the soul on display through speech, the speaker can often be telling the listener more than he means to. Things slip out. Browning's dramatic monologues, the greatest of them, manage to give rounded portraits of people who have no idea that a rounded portrait is being given. "I'm grown peaceful as old age tonight," says Andrea del Sarto, the faultless painter, in one Browning monologue. "I regret little, I would change still less. Since there my past life lies, why alter it?" We hear so much irony in that, not least the irony in a word like lies. For Andrea del Sarto, the life is lying in front of him. Of course, we can hear the lies by which he has lived and which he has chosen to ignore.
Time and again, Browning chose to express his views on human life through the dramatic monologue, with the past providing its subject matter. It was to be a work in that tradition that eventually made his name. In 1868, back in London after the tragically early death of his wife, Browning published The Ring and the Book, a composition in which he radically extended his use of the monologue technique. Its subject matter was an obscure murder case in 17th century Italy. No fewer than 12 different monologues make up what is effectively a verse detective novel. Its timing was excellent. 1868 was the year which saw the publication of Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, widely considered to be the first true detective novel. The Ring and the Book was rapturously received by the reading public.
By the time he published The Ring and the Book, he was well established as a major Victorian poet. One reviewer thought that The Ring and the Book was the best thing in English poetry since Shakespeare. Like many 19th century poets, Browning suffered a decline in reputation in the early years of the 20th century, when the modernists were busy rejecting the Victorians and the Romantics. However, this was not really a serious matter. His reputation soon revived, and today he's still very much felt to be one of the two major Victorian poets with Tennyson.
As with Tennyson, it is to Browning's earlier work that the modern reader must turn for the full expression of his genius. The monologues produced during his Italian years remain amongst the finest of all Victorian verse.
Oh, Galuppi, Baldassaro, this is very sad to find. I can hardly misconceive you. It would prove me deaf and blind. But although I take your meaning, 'tis with such a heavy mind. Here you come with your old music, and here's all the good it brings. What? They lived once thus at Venice, where the merchants were the kings? Where St. Mark's is? Where the doges used to wed the sea with rings? Aye? Because the sea's the street there, and 'tis arched by what you call Shylock's Bridge with houses on it, where they kept the carnival. I was never out of England. It's as if I saw it all.
It is appropriate that the last years of Robert Browning's life were spent in Italy, the country that so influenced his finest works. Like Tennyson, he continued to work until the end of his life, until, on December 12, 1889, he died in Venice. By that time, back in England, Queen Victoria was in the 53rd year on the throne of a nation confident, wealthy and powerful. It is curious that the later period of the Victorian age failed to produce a single English poet in the class of Keats, Wordsworth or the younger Tennyson. What it did produce was a number of minor poets, the best of whose work remains of great literary value today. Amongst their number was Matthew Arnold. Perhaps it was unsurprising that Matthew Arnold became a well-known Victorian. One of the most distinctive features of Victorian society was the rise of the English public school system, with its emphasis on academic excellence and the fostering of the team spirit. This system was largely the result of the man who was headmaster of the great Rugby public school in the 1830s, Thomas Arnold, the father of Matthew. Born in 1822, Matthew Arnold attended Rugby during his father's time there and spent his summers in the English Lake District, where his neighbour was the great Wordsworth, before moving up to Balliol College at Oxford University.
Matthew Arnold was one of those gilded youths of his age. He was one of an intellectual elite up at Oxford. He sought out poetic experience. He attempted in his own work to emulate the great Romantic writers whom he so admired, Wordsworth preeminently, Shelley too, and also continental writers, notably Heinrich Heine.
Like Tennyson and Browning, he very much fell under the spell of the Romantics, in his case Wordsworth. And so much of Arnold's poetry is a return in various complicated ways to some of Wordsworth's poems, and you can trace links between the two.
Throughout his working life, Matthew Arnold's work is characterised by a seriousness and sobriety of tone. In much of his finest verse, it is melancholy and sadness that are the dominant emotional themes.
Go, for they call you, shepherd from the hill. Go, shepherd, and untie the wattle coats. No longer leave thy wistful flock unfed, nor let thy bawling fellows rack their throats, nor the cropped herbage shoot another head. But when the fields are still, and the tired men and dogs all gone to rest, and only the white sheep are sometimes seen cross and recross the strips of moon-blanched green, come, shepherd, and again begin the quest.
Published in 1853, The Scholar Gypsy reveals more than just Arnold's calm, elegiac, poetic manner. It demonstrates his ongoing interest in the concept of the man of action, the action hero of classical mythology. The sadness arises from the poet's belief in the impossibility of such a hero existing in his own time. Certainly, Arnold's own life failed to satisfy his own strict criteria of heroism, but his years were undeniably constructive. In 1857, he returned to Oxford as Professor of Poetry, all the time maintaining his duties as a schools inspector. Unsurprisingly, his poetic output was limited. But in 1867, he produced one of the finest poems of the age, Dover Beach. The melancholy of the final stanza is especially striking.
The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window. Sweet is the night air. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night.
When the first collected Matthew Arnold comes out in the late 1860s, he writes to his mum and he says, I don't have some of the powers that Tennyson has and Browning has, but my poems give a better picture of the movement of mind in the years during which I've been writing than theirs. In other words, he thinks of himself as a poet who has greater intellectual capacity, really, and engagement. He himself said in a famous lecture that poetry should be adequate, by which he meant that the best poetry must sufficiently reflect the most advanced thought of its age.
I think the thing for the modern reader that comes across with Arnold is his sense of the modern. He talked about the strange disease of modern life, and we instinctively warmed to that. He felt troubled by it, he sought comfort in nature, and he was able to express, as he does in Dover Beach, a feeling of alienation, of anxiety, of melancholy.
Dover Beach was included in Arnold's final compilation of poetry, published in 1867. Until his death in 1888, his writings were mainly in the form of literary criticism, and his essays on the importance of culture are still widely read. But Matthew Arnold was never a truly happy man. We might describe his life as typically Victorian, with its overbearing sense of duty, sobriety and analysis. But there was another side to the Victorian character, one much condemned in recent times. In terms of personal morality, many modern critics see the Victorian age as the most hypocritical period in English history. Though Britain was powerful, its society was harshly divided on class lines, and many members of the upper classes were happy to preach a God-fearing, temperate lifestyle to the lower orders while living their own lives in debauchery. One man who enjoyed such a dissolute lifestyle was the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne. Born in 1837, Swinburne was born into the good life. The son of an admiral, he attended Eton College and Oxford, and at both institutions, pleasure triumphed over academic achievement. With his private means, it hardly mattered that he left Oxford without a degree. He moved to London to become a man of letters, although he was as well known for his drinking and dubious sexual conduct. But he was an intelligent man and widely read, especially in European literature.
Swinburne's early life, I suppose, was pretty excessive by Victorian standards of respectable morality. His interest in Sard, of course, but also the fact that he did visit whipping parlours in St John's Wood and was clearly fascinated by flagellation. He also drank to excess. These, of course, were vices that many Victorian gentlemen shared, but they certainly couldn't have been spoken about in respectable society.
Swinburne was a member of the English aristocracy. In fact, he was, if we want to think about it in terms like this, the highest born English poet since Shelley. His father was an admiral. It mattered more to Swinburne that his maternal grandfather was a French aristocrat from the days of the Ancien Regime. We should be aware that Swinburne identified from his youth very strongly with France and continental Europe, in preference to what he saw as a moribund England.
He was amongst the first English admirers of the works of Baudelaire, but for his first significant work, the verse drama Atalanta in Calydon, it was Greek tragedy that provided the inspiration for a poem of overwhelmingly rhythmic lyricism.
Thou art swift and subtle and blind as a flame of fire. Before thee the laughter, behind thee the tears of desire. And twain go forth beside thee, a man with a maid. Her eyes are the eyes of a bride whom delight makes afraid. As the breath in the buds that stir is her bridal breath. But fate is the name of her, and his name is death.
A powerful sense of rhythm characterises much of Swinburne's best poetry, and many were impressed at the time. The critic John Ruskin described Atalanta in Calydon as the greatest work ever done by a youth. But with his next publication, the anthology Poems and Ballads, many were simply shocked by what they read. Swinburne was familiar with the explicit erotic works of that most controversial of literary figures, the Marquis de Sade. Sade's belief that pain and pleasure are sexually linked was undoubtedly an influence on Swinburne's work.
If you were queen of pleasure, and I were king of pain, we'd hunt down love together, pluck out his flying feather, and teach his feet a measure, and find his mouth a rein. If you were queen of pleasure, and I were king of pain.
Verses like these divided Victorian opinion. Famously, groups of admiring Oxford students took to loudly reciting his work in the street. Others saw him as a satanic, dangerous figure. Swinburne himself simply carried on with his lifestyle of excess, writing whenever he saw fit.
The stories which circulated about Swinburne were extreme and excessive ones. It's interesting, though, that they were circulated by Swinburne as well as about him. It was for that reason, and in relation to a particularly unpleasant tale involving a monkey and a strange thing to eat, that Oscar Wilde referred to Swinburne as a braggart in matters of vice.
At a point in which Tennyson and Browning were middle-aged, settled into their modes of production, Swinburne is the one who comes along and changes it all. And one of the ways in which he does that is by making poetry sing again, by reasserting the musicality of English verse. Of course, he introduces a new theory of art to English poetry, which is, broadly speaking, the theory of art for art's sake. I mean, the notion that poetry does not have to be moral in order to be good, that it can be very immoral and yet still be beautiful as poetry.
At his best, which I would say was in Poems and Ballads verse series, or in a poem like Atalanta in Calydon, he is metrically very exciting. He gives a great vividness of atmosphere, of landscape. I also think personally that some of the poems of Poems and Ballads which have an erotic content, like Dolores or Faustine, are great fun. They're full of vampiric biting, roses, blood and rapture, and I think that they do stand the test of time.
Inevitably, Swinburne's lifestyle caught up with him. By 1879, he was an alcoholic whose addiction was killing him. That year, he left the temptations of London for the leafy suburban home of an old friend. The move saved his life. For the next 30 years, he continued to write, turning his hand to drama and criticism, as had many of his fellow Victorians. But his best work had been done whilst still in London. And in some of his best poems, the wildness and abandon that characterised his life can also be seen in his approach to structure, metre, and the sound of words themselves.
In a coign of the cliff between lowland and highland, at the sea down's edge between windward and lee, walled round with rocks as an inland island, the ghost of a garden fronts the sea. A girdle of brushwood and thorn encloses the steep square slope of the blossomless bed, where the weeds that grew green from the graves of its roses now lie dead.
A poem such as this demonstrates Swinburne's enthusiasm for alliteration, the poetic repetition of consonantal sounds. This long-standing poetic technique was also widely used by the final important figure of the Victorian age, a man whose character and life were the complete opposite of Swinburne's. Gerard Manley Hopkins. Born in 1844 in a small town to the east of London, Gerard Manley Hopkins lived his life in utter obscurity. It would be 30 years after his death before his works became known, and in his own lifetime, he was often lonely, troubled, and sick. Like Swinburne, Hopkins attended Balliol College, Oxford. Unlike Swinburne, the interests of Hopkins were those of the spirit, not the flesh. A deeply religious young man, he also thought intensely about the poetry he had begun to write. He developed a metaphysical notion of the individuality of things, which he referred to as the inscape, entirely appropriate for a man whose life would be essentially self-contained. Thankfully, Hopkins' Oxford days did provide Hopkins with his one lifelong friend, fellow poet Robert Bridges. His friendship would be vital in establishing his eventual status as a significant Victorian poet.
Hopkins' life has been described by his biographer Norman White as an unpatterned succession of turmoils, which I think is a very nice phrase. He was often an unhappy man. His conversion to Catholicism isolated him in many respects from mainstream English society. He was also deeply guilt-ridden about his feelings towards young men, Digby Dolben, for instance, and his love of poetry, which he felt conflicted with his religious faith.
There's hundreds of Victorian religious poets in the sense of writing about religion, but writing of one's own spiritual experience is rather rarer in the 19th century, and Hopkins does it remarkably. I suppose a hostile view of Hopkins would be that it is a bit private, it is a bit of a kind of coterie, perhaps slightly overworked poetry. But nonetheless, there is an element of an unusual degree of sort of sincere articulation of spiritual experience and verbal daring at work in it.
As a man, Gerard Manley Hopkins was almost impossibly obscure. At Oxford he became a Roman Catholic. 2 years later he joined the Jesuit sect and moved to Wales to begin the lonely, protracted and arduous process of training as a Jesuit priest. One consequence of this was that he destroyed virtually all the poetry of his youth. For years he wrote nothing. Only in 1875 did he return to verse with a poem approved by his Jesuit superiors, an account of a shipwreck in which several nuns died. But it was a difficult and impenetrable work, with the poet possibly trying to achieve too much too soon after his long silence. The work was unpublished, but he was writing again and developing a radical approach to structure and rhythm. God himself was the subject matter for some of his greatest work.
The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod. And all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastwards, springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings.
Gerard Hopkins used to write long, long letters to friends, in particular his friend Robert Bridges, enclosing a poem and then giving detailed instructions on exactly how that poem was put together, how it worked. Hopkins wasn't asking the kinds of questions that we, as modern writers and critics, might ask. What does it mean? What's this about? He was much more interested in exactly the nuts and bolts of each line, of how accent, stress and rhythm could be seen to work.
Prior to the advent of modernist free verse, there are two different kinds of rhythm. There's the kind that was current until the Renaissance, in which all that matters is how many beats there are in a line, how many stressed syllables there are in a line. At the time of the Renaissance, we replaced that with a slightly more complicated form of metre, accentual syllabic rhythm, in which the number of unstressed syllables in the line matter as well as the number of stressed syllables. The interesting thing was that the old system, accentual scansion, survived in popular verse, like nursery rhymes. Ding dong bell, pussy's in the well, which 3 beats a line, but no, in some lines there are no unstressed syllables at all, ding dong bell. In others, pussy's in the well, there are some unstressed syllables. Hopkins, who says perfectly openly, yes, of course you can find it in nursery rhymes. What he does really is just take it and say, I'm going to write serious adult poetry in what other people would call accentual scansion, but which he calls sprung rhythm.
Usually poetry is based on a fairly regular alternation of stressed with unstressed syllables. What Hopkins did with his sprung rhythm was really to break that regularity up in a very radical way and to cram in more stressed syllables juxtaposed than is usual in English verse. This is from Pied Beauty. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a-dazzle, dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. And you can hear then, and I was trying to emphasise, the stressed rhythms of that poem, praise him at the end, a hymn of praise to God. It gives the poetry an enormous vitality, buoyancy, vigour. It's a muscular poetry.
He himself realised that he could find sprung rhythm not only in medieval writers, but in some Shakespeare. He could find it in late Milton. He could find it in more recent writers like Coleridge in Christabel or Christina Rossetti in Goblin Market. He tried to formalise this. In fact, of course, as with almost any poet's setting out of rules about verse, what he was doing was describing what verse was for him. Sprung rhythm doesn't translate easily as prescriptive practice.
In 1877, Hopkins finally qualified as a Jesuit priest, but by now he was already growing ill. His duties took him to Lancashire, where he found the industrial landscape deeply depressing. In 1884, still ill, he moved to Dublin to become Professor of Greek at University College, a move which did nothing for his mood. Lonely, sick and overworked, he was able to express his feelings in a series of sonnets that make Matthew Arnold's sense of melancholy look positively joyful by comparison. Yet despite their darkness, the so-called terrible sonnets have proved profoundly influential in the century that followed.
I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours? Oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you, heart, saw, ways you went, and more must, in yet longer light delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste, my taste was me. Bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed the curse. Self-yeast of spirit, a dull dough soars. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be as I am mine, their sweating selves, but worse.
His poems are only published as a volume, I mean substantially, after the First World War, at the moment when everybody was turning against Victorian culture, root and branch. It was considered one of the effects of the First World War. There was a tremendous rejection of Victorian architecture, Victorian painting, Victorian poetry, Victorian moral codes, Victorian social behaviour and so forth. Hopkins, because he only gets published after the First World War, is accorded the status of an honorary modernist. It's as if he sort of, in a mysterious way, is a contemporary of Pound and Eliot and so on. And the difficulty of his poetry, the fact some of the sort of tricky things, ingenious things he does with language, also seem, whether rightly or wrongly, seem to align him with some of the things that Pound and Eliot have been doing in the first 2 decades of the 20th century.
He had a great effect on the poets of the 30s, W.H. Auden, for instance. Also of the 40s and beyond. Dylan Thomas was very influenced by Hopkins. Ted Hughes's early poetry and Seamus Heaney's early poetry show the effects of Hopkins' language and his rhythms and his use of alliteration.
His influence in terms of religious poetry has been extensive in the 20th century. Like all important poets, he has bad influence as well as good influence. And it's fair to say that Hopkins has encouraged a certain spiritual wooziness in his less able imitators.
Gerard Manley Hopkins eventually died in 1889. In 1918, his surviving work was collected together by his old friend Robert Bridges and published. But by that time, the Victorian age in which he had lived his entire life was long since over. Victoria had died in 1901, and by 1918 the Great War had ended forever Britain's status as a superpower. But the poetry of the age lives on to this day, and the work of the finest Victorian poets continues to inspire, to delight, and to stimulate.